the summer of 1966, Buffalo Springfield was the hottest band on the LA music scene. A contract with Atlantic Records soon followed. Neil Young finally had the success he craved, but at a price.
Teenagers, especially teenage girls, buy the 45s, buy the albums. You know, in Hit Parader magazine, I mean, there would be articles that would say, "Win a dream date with Buffalo Neil." So there was that adulation element, that fan adulation element of the Buffalo Springfield that Neil had a lot of difficulty dealing with.
The counterculture was hotting up. Sex and drugs were readily available, especially to rock stars on the rise. For a self-conscious, shy young man from Canada, it was both a blessing and a curse.
Neil was the kind of guy that a lot of girls were drawn to, even though he was kind of like unkempt, but there was sort of a darker edge to Neil than there was to anybody else. People found that intriguing. He was a lot of fun. I spent time alone with him, just, photographing him up at his house. And people were always partying, and everybody was being nude and all that kind of stuff, which I never did see Neil in the nude. Steve, yes.
The battle for creative control of the band raged on. Still's drive to make Buffalo Springfield a popular success collided with Neil's demand for artistic integrity.
One of the problems really was the fact that it was Stephen's band from the get-go. That was very difficult for Neil because Neil had, with the exception of the Minor Birds, always been in charge of his bands.
They really kind of wrote alone as opposed to writing together, and it was kind of competitive between them.
Tempers flared. Screaming matches were common. As the pressures on Neil mounted, the results were disastrous.
The stress coupled with the fact that strobe lights trigger epileptic seizures. And light shows were just coming in at that time, and they would play clubs, they would play concerts, and the strobe lights would come on, and quite often Neil would have a seizure. Richie would say he would look over, and if Neil sort of started getting a little rigid and maybe shaking a bit, and you could see his eyes kind of rolling, Richie would stop playing and grab his guitar, so that when Neil fell, the guitar wouldn't break or fall.
While Buffalo Springfield rolled on, Neil's world was spinning out of control. He became increasingly elusive and withdrawn, skipped rehearsals, and missed gigs.
They're going to go on the Tonight Show. Neil bails out of the band. Nowhere to be found. Not the first time, not the last time. Dewey Martin, who's their drummer, he was livid with this guy because Neil was just AWOL. He didn't want to be on TV. TV was not what he was about.
By January 1968, the tensions between Stills and Neil reached breaking point. A fight broke out and the two had to be separated. The band was fast disintegrating. 2 months later, police busted a party. Stills slipped out of a window and escaped, but Neil, Richie, and friend Eric Clapton were arrested, strip-searched, and taken to jail. Although the charges were dropped, it was the last straw. On the 5th of May 1968, Buffalo Springfield gave its farewell performance. They had been together for just 18 months.
I don't think they were given as much credit by the sort of world at large, our world here in LA, for their enormous abilities. I mean, it was more like the Doors, who I really thought, I thought they were good, but I didn't think they were on the level of the Buffalo Springfield.
The sad tale of the Buffalo Springfield is they were probably, at that time in 1966, the most talented band in the United States. They could have been the contenders had they had the right management, had they had the right ability to stay together. I think we'd be speaking of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Buffalo Springfield, and the Byrds, all within the same context.
Neil was emotionally exhausted.
Where other people might have had a groovy experience in that 60s period, I think for Neil, it was a time of frustration and fear and feeling out of control. And you find that right after that time, not long after that time, he retreats from LA, first to Topanga Canyon and then up North California.
Located in an isolated stretch of mountains between Los Angeles and Malibu, Topanga Canyon was the ideal refuge for the LA-weary musician. At a local cafe, Neil met a waitress named Susan Acevedes, whom he later married.
Neil was testing the waters as a solo artist. He had a wealth of songs that had not been released when he was in Springfield, and he was also writing new material, and again he was just testing out those songs live in performance and in the studio.
Though he released a solo album and played acoustic gigs where he could find them, Neil still wanted to rock, and for that he needed a band. He sometimes gigged with the Rockets, a band fronted by a talented troubled guitarist named Danny Whitten. Neil took the band over and renamed it Crazy Horse. It was an inspired match. Neil Young and Crazy Horse went on to make classic rock and roll, on and off for decades.
Watching Neil Young and Crazy Horse play live, right after they recorded Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, was like standing at the top of the highest mountain on the most beautiful day and having the wind blowing with air so pure that it hurt to breathe.
Since the breakup of Buffalo Springfield, Neil Young had established himself as a solo artist and launched a stirring collaboration with Crazy Horse. But his successes paled in comparison to those of his former bandmate, Stephen Stills.
Laurel Canyon in 1968 was a destination for a number of musicians between bands, including David Crosby and Stephen Stills, and ultimately Graham Nash of the Hollies. One afternoon, and no one can be certain if it was Joni Mitchell's living room or Cass Elliott's kitchen, but Crosby, Stills, and Nash sang together for the first time. And when that occurred, their lives were never the same.
Crosby, Stills and Nash were at the height of their fame, rocketing up both the singles and album charts. Fans demanded a tour, but there was a problem.
They could not take the album on the road because Stephen Stills played so many instruments on the record and earned the nickname Captain Many Hands. So Stephen went to Neil Young at the suggestion, frankly, of Ahmet Ertegun, then president of Atlantic Records, and tried to rekindle the relationship that they had in Buffalo Springfield.
So after we had our first big success with Crosby, Stills and Nash, and we were having a meeting at my house with all the guys, I said, you know, wouldn't it be great if Neil was with this group, you know? I mean, and Stephen Stills said, yeah, man, I guess we shouldn't have broken up.
Neil was interested and explained why to a press conference before the band's reunion tour in 2000.
We already had our history. We already had roots in playing together and developing our musical styles and learning how to play guitars together.
Neil agreed to sign to the tour, but with one condition: equal billing. It was a life-altering decision. The addition of Neil Young instantly took the band's success to another level. One of their first performances was in front of 400,000 Rain-drenched fans at Woodstock. Woodstock made Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young instant cultural icons, the musical voice of a generation.
They also really came upon a sound that allowed them to be truly spokesmen for a generation. They were talking about issues, expressing feelings, and musically driving home messages that were at the heart of the people that were coming to their shows. When they looked up on stage, they saw themselves.
Hailed by fans and critics alike, the band soared to new heights. But the euphoria couldn't be sustained forever. Heavy drug use fed paranoia and emotional meltdowns. Once more, Stills and Young locked horns over creative control.
Try to get this guy to do anything, and you will find out it ain't going to happen unless it happens in his way. And if he wants to happen upside down with all of you wearing buffalo skins while beating a gong, you better get busy on the gong, Jack, because it's definitely going to happen that way.
Finally, Neil had had enough.
They tried to finish recording the second CSNY album in Sausalito, California. During the session, David Crosby and Stephen Stills had an argument over a single harmony note and decided to take a break, and CSNY went outside, and at that point, David Crosby remembered, "I could feel the pendulum swing." Neil said, "I'll see you guys tomorrow," and he never came back.
Career frustrations took their toll at home, and Neil's marriage to Susan collapsed. The pain of the breakup contributed to his next solo album, After the Gold Rush, considered by many to be his masterpiece.
And it truly solidified his standing as a successful solo artist. With acoustic guitar songs, electric songs, with Crazy Horse, with Stephen Stills, it really covered the whole spectrum of his strengths as an artist.
By 1971, Neil Young was music's most reclusive superstar. Moving to Broken Arrow Ranch near San Francisco, he planted 140 acres of ancient redwoods between himself and the prying eyes of the world. Trusted friends and business associates closed ranks around him, forming an impenetrable ring.
You know, he's got managers and producers, all people who are characters in their own right, who will definitely kill for the guy. And he's sort of got this sort of moat, a protective outer crust to him that he didn't have in the 60s time.
One person Neil allowed in was actress Carrie Snodgrass. She'd burst into the limelight in the black comedy Diary of a Mad Housewife, which Neil had seen. Friends arranged a meeting, and love blossomed. Carrie was every bit Neil's opposite, open, loving and free-spirited. Her friends dropped by the ranch and stayed for weeks. But Neil was too dazzled to care, recording an album of tender lyrical ballads called Harvest. It shot to #1 on the Billboard charts. Neil Young was in love, and the record-buying public was in love with Neil Young. On the momentum of Harvest, Neil prepared for the biggest tour of his career, calling on his old friend from Crazy Horse, Danny Whitten, to join him. Although heavily into heroin abuse, he promised he'd stay clean. When Whitten broke his promise, Neil handed him $50 and a ticket back to LA. A few days later, Danny Whitten was dead from an overdose.
Danny Whitten, who was just a sublime songwriter, singer, musician, who just gave the right nuance to Neil's playing.
Danny's suicide and the drug-related death of roadie friend Bruce Berry cast a dark shadow over Neil's life.
When Danny Whitten died, Neil Young was on the cusp of going on the biggest tour of his life, and it cast a pall over the rehearsals and the concerts themselves.
Audiences, expecting the blissful sounds of Harvest, were confused and upset. Neil forged on, hammered out a string of albums, each more disturbing and less successful than the last.
He'd do a record like Tonight's the Night, which is, you know, a yowling, howling mess of a record where everybody's, you know, blotto and reminiscing about dead musicians and friends. People were kind of upset. There wasn't, you know, the mellow hippie in the field playing a folky number.
Neil had also started drinking heavily. He signed for a tour with Crosby, Stills and Nash, then backed out at the last minute. His bandmates were left to clean up the mess. And his relationship with Carrie suffered. Rumours of her infidelity dealt the final blow. It was Neil's darkest hour. He poured his heart out to a pretty blonde waitress named Peggy Morton,